These lectures are part of the Great Courses series. They are produced by the Teaching Company. The Great Courses cover a broad array of university-level disciplines. The lectures in each course are either 30 or 45 minutes long. By listening for less than an hour a day, you can finish even the longest course in just weeks. Browse our catalog or website and imagine how much you could learn if you spent just 30 minutes a day for the next year in the best college classrooms in the world. The lecturers are university professors carefully selected by the Teaching Company and its customers for intellectual distinction and teaching excellence. These lectures are titled Great Authors of the Western Literary Tradition. The faculty for this course includes Professors Elizabeth Vandiver, Thomas Noble, Ronald Hertzman, Susan Sage Heinzelman, and James A.W. Heffernan. Part 1, Near Eastern and Mediterranean Foundations. The lecturer for Parts 1 and 2 is Dr. Elizabeth Vandiver. Dr. Vandiver is a professor of classics at Whitman College. She received her B.A. from Shimer College and went on to earn her M.A. and Ph.D. from the University of Texas at Austin. Before coming to Whitman College, Professor Vandiver was Distinguished Visiting Lecturer in the Department of Greek and Roman Studies at Rhodes College in Memphis, Tennessee. She has also served as the Director of the Honors Humanities Program at the University of Maryland and held visiting professorships at Northwestern University, the University of Georgia, the Intercollegiate Center for Classical Studies in Rome, and Loyola University. In 1998, Dr. Vandiver received the American Philological Association's Excellence in Teaching Award, the most prestigious teaching award available to American classicists. Her other awards include the Northwestern University Department of Classics Excellence in Teaching Award for 1998, and the University of Georgia's Outstanding Honors Professor Award in 1993 and 1994. Professor Vandiver is the author of Heroes in Herodotus, The Interaction of Myth and History. She has published several articles and delivered numerous papers at national and international conferences. Professor Vandiver prepared the course guide that comes with these lectures. The course guide includes a detailed outline of each lecture, a glossary, a timeline, biographical notes, and an annotated bibliography. To get the most out of this course, you may find it useful to follow along with the outlines or review them before or after each lecture. Lecture 1, Foundations.
Hello, and welcome to this introductory lecture on great authors of the Western literary tradition. My name's Elizabeth Vandiver. I teach classics at Whitman College, and in this first lecture I have two main objectives. First, to introduce you to the overall concept of the 7-part course that we're going to be doing on great authors of the Western literary tradition, and then specifically to introduce you to the first 2 parts, which I will be delivering on the ancient world. So my first objective is to talk about the overall shape of the course, what we're setting out to do here. I'll begin by defining the terms Western and literary, or literature, as we're using them in this course, and then I'll briefly describe to you the different parts of the course and what the lectures in each part by the 5 different lecturers, including me, will cover. And then my second main objective is to introduce and set the parameters for my own parts of the course, parts 1 and 2, which focus on the ancient world. And there I'll set out the specific authors and works from Mesopotamian, Hebrew, Greek, and Roman culture that I'll be talking about. I'll outline for you the approach that I'm planning to take in parts 1 and 2, and I'll consider at the end of the lecture some of the difficulties inherent in studying ancient literature, in particular literature that was developed or founded on oral tradition rather than being created by one author creating out of his own or her own literary genius. So to start out with, for the overall parameters of the course, what do we mean by the Western literary tradition? Western, as we're using it here, could be broadly defined to mean the literature of European and European-derived cultures from the ancient world onward. I say European-derived, obviously, to cover cultures like, well, our own, American, Australian, Canadian, South American. All of those cultures draw on earlier European literature in their own literary works. But using the term European to describe Western literature, even in the earliest stages, poses many questions itself. Because, first of all, as I've already said, I'm starting with Mesopotamian and Hebrew literature. That's not European, that's Near Eastern. And even when we get on into the classical world, near the end of part 2, we'll see authors such as Apuleius and Augustine, both of whom were actually African. We consider them members of the Western literary tradition because they were citizens of the Roman Empire and wrote in Latin. But clearly, European as a geographical term is not quite right for what we mean by Western. Another way of putting it, and I think this is more useful, would be to say that the Western literary tradition is the tradition whose main sources of inspiration, whose main foundational texts are the Bible on the one hand, both the Hebrew Bible and the New Testament, and ancient Greek and Roman literature on the other hand. So those cultures that derive their main sources of information from those two sources, the Bible and classical literature, that's what we mean by the Western tradition. What about literature? That's probably even more difficult to define than Western. The basic sense of the term is something written, something in letters. That's what literature means. But, as I already mentioned very briefly in passing, and as we'll see in the next several lectures in particular, many of the works we're going to consider were composed originally without the aid of writing. So if we define literature as works that were created in writing, then we have to leave out, the Homeric epics, the Epic of Gilgamesh, a good part of the Bible. So that doesn't really work either. Now, we could get around this issue by saying that for the purposes of this course, at least, literature consists of works preserved in writing, whether they were originally composed orally or in writing. We have them now in writing. Okay, but does any written work qualify as literature, or is literature a subset of written materials? If we turn to the Oxford English Dictionary, we'll find, among other meanings, definition 3a says that literature is, quote, the body of writings produced in a particular country or period or in the world in general. I think most of us would say that's too broad a definition to be terribly helpful. If literature includes the body of writings produced in a culture, then the phone book, the Sears catalog, and the advertisements that come in your daily newspaper would have to be considered literature. And I think most of us would draw the line somewhere lower than that, or somewhere higher than that, perhaps I should say. Another possible approach to defining what we mean by literature would be to say that it means narrative, i.e. the use of language to tell a story. And that will cover many of the genres we will encounter in this course, both in poetry and in prose. For instance, epic, history, drama, even short lyric poems, all can be said to tell a story in some sense or another. Novels, certainly, in the later part of the course. But there are other works, particularly those that you'll study in parts 4 and 5 on medieval and Renaissance literature, that aren't narrative in the sense of telling a story. Rather, they're philosophical, meditative, or exploratory texts, and yet most of us would certainly still include works by such authors as Descartes, Rousseau, Voltaire as literature. So perhaps the most useful approach is to define literature not so much through its form, written and or narrative, as through its effect. And here, if we turn back to the Oxford English Dictionary, we find a continuation of the definition that I think is more helpful. Quote, literature is now also used in a more restricted sense, applied to writing which has claim to consideration on the ground of beauty of form or emotional effect, close quote. And I think that's probably the key to what most of us understand when we use the term literature, that it's not just writing of any kind, but it's writing that has a claim to consideration, again, on the ground of beauty of form and emotional effect. So that leaves out not only the phone book, it also leaves out the National Enquirer and various other forms of writing that most of us would not consider literature. So, if those working definitions will do to go on with, I could probably spend a whole course of 24 lectures trying to figure out exactly what's Western and what's literature. But if we can go on with these working definitions, what are we trying to do in this course? In this course, the 4 other lecturers and I are setting out to offer you a sampling of great literature of the Western tradition. And I really want to underline for you that word sampling. The name of this course is not all the great authors of the Western literary tradition, or even the great authors of the Western literary tradition. It's great authors. You might even want to put a some in before that, some great authors of the Western literary tradition. It would not be possible, even in a multi-part course like this one, to cover anything like all the high points of Western literature. Each professor, each one of us, will discuss a few of the most important authors from our given periods, but it's important to remember throughout the course that the selection has had to be arbitrary to some extent and that a very great deal is being left out. I will mention throughout these lectures authors that I wish we had time to devote a lecture to and we don't. Aristotle, Cicero, Suetonius are a few of the names that occur to me and to whom I will refer in lectures on other authors, but we don't have a lecture on any one of those 3. And I'm sure that my colleagues, other 4 lecturers, each of them, will also refer to authors that they wish they could talk about but don't have time for. A great deal had to be omitted. And as is the case with any survey or smorgasbord type course, we can't go into depth on any of the authors or works that we do discuss. Those of you who are former teaching company customers who have bought teaching company courses before will realize that what we're doing in this course is, in effect, the opposite of what we normally do in a teaching company course. Normally, we go into 12 or 24 lectures worth of depth on one author or a couple of authors. For instance, I did a course on Herodotus, the Greek historian, in which I spent 24 lectures talking about Herodotus, his cultural background, his achievement, and so forth. In this course, Herodotus gets one 30-minute lecture. Clearly, we can't go into depth or into detail on any of what we're covering, and that's why I'm calling this a smorgasbord. We're offering you a sampling. We're scratching the surface and hoping to whet your appetite for more and point you in directions where you can usefully go for more. So the course is divided into 7 main sections, each one focusing on the literature of a particular historical period. We've tried to range fairly widely in geography and in genre to give you a true sampling of the different forms of literature, the different kinds of literature, as well as the different eras that we're looking at. Parts 1 and 2, which I deliver, cover the roots of the Western literary tradition in Mesopotamia, with the Epic of Gilgamesh, and in the Hebrew Scriptures. And then we trace the development of literature in classical Greek and Roman culture. And I'll come back in just a few minutes and talk in more detail about what I'm doing in my parts of the course. Part 3, which is taught by Professor Thomas Noble, covers literature of the Middle Ages. He'll start with Beowulf. And this section is especially rich in epic. Along with Beowulf, you'll also be studying the Song of Roland, the Song of the Cid, Dante's Divine Comedy, and various other works. In Part 4, Professor Ronald Hertzman looks at the literature of the Renaissance. Here you will meet humanists such as Erasmus and More, essayists such as Montaigne, as well as Cervantes' great novel Don Quixote, and you'll also study the plays of Shakespeare, Marlowe, Lope de Vega, obviously a great deal packed into that one section. In Part 5, Professor Susan Heinzelman will discuss the neoclassical literature of the 17th century, starting with the French playwrights Molière and Racine. She will then turn to the 18th century, often called the Age of Enlightenment or Age of Reason, and will discuss Rousseau, Voltaire, and others. And she'll end that section with looking into the 19th century and Romanticism by discussing Blake and Goethe. And then finally, in parts 6 and 7, Professor James Heffernan will bring you to the modern world by examining the literature of the 19th century and 20th century. Here he will discuss poetry, but this section is especially rich in novels. Austen, Dickens, Dostoevsky, Tolstoy, all of those writers will make an appearance in parts 6 and 7. So that's the overall shape of the course. A very great deal being covered, also, unfortunately, more than we would like being left out. But as I said, think of it as a smorgasbord and a sampling. That's what we're trying to do for you. To talk in a bit more detail about parts 1 and 2, in those two sections of the course, we'll discuss the foundations and beginnings of the Western literary tradition. And these sections range very widely within themselves over time and over cultures. The basic organization that I've devised here is chronological. Occasionally, I'll break the chronological frame a bit. For instance, the last two lectures of part 2, lectures 23 and 24, are on the Gospels and St. Augustine. If I were going in purely chronological order, I would have needed to put the Gospels a couple of lectures back. But it seemed to make sense to group the two lectures on Christian literature together. But the basic organization is chronological. The first part of the course, dealing with Near Eastern and Mediterranean foundations of the Western tradition, lays the groundwork for our discussion and brings us up to the high point of classical Greek literature in 5th century Athens. We'll begin in Lecture 2 with the earliest known work of literature, the Mesopotamian epic of Gilgamesh. We'll then turn to the Hebrew Bible, and lectures 3 through 6 will consider some of the most important texts in that foundational collection of literature. After that, we'll move on to Greek culture, beginning in lectures 7 and 8 with the epics of Homer. Lecture 7 is on the Iliad, lecture 8 is on the Odyssey. In lecture 9, we'll look at Greek lyric poetry, focusing especially on the works of Sappho and of Pindar. And then the last 3 lectures of part 1, lectures 10, 11, and 12, bring us to the classical age of Athenian literature by discussing the works of the 3 great tragedians, Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides. In part 2, we'll continue our survey of Greek literature in lectures 13 through 17, and then move on to Roman culture and Roman literature. Lectures 13 and 14 continue our look at 5th century Athenian literature by talking about the 2 great historians, Herodotus and Thucydides. Lecture 15 takes us back to theater with discussing the comic playwright Aristophanes, who wrote during the end of the 5th and the beginning of the 4th centuries BC. The 4th century was also the time when Greek philosophy came into its own, and particularly with the works of Plato and Aristotle. In lecture 16, and I have to say this is one of the places where I feel the most, well, I won't say unhappiness, but where it was hardest to put what I wanted to say into one 30-minute lecture. We don't talk about Aristotle. Plato gets only 30 minutes, and in that time we really only look at the Republic, and within the Republic we focus on Plato's own view of literature. So lecture 16 is on Plato. In lecture 17, we move on to talking about the Hellenistic age, that is the age in Greek culture that followed the high point of Greek classical literature, was the 5th century. The Hellenistic age begins in the 4th century and runs through the 1st century BC. We'll talk in lecture 17 about the comic playwright Menander, and then about Hellenistic literature in particular, especially touching on the poet Callimachus and his work in the Great Library and Museum of Alexandria. Then in lecture 18, 19, and 20, we turn to Roman poetry. Lecture 18 discusses the Roman lyric poets Catullus and Horace. Lecture 19, Virgil and his great epic, the Aeneid. And lecture 20, Ovid. All of these poets, Catullus, Horace, Virgil, and Ovid, had enormous, incalculable influence on later Western literary works. And so they are crucially important, not just in their own right, but in the influence they had on the later authors you'll be studying. Lectures 21 and 22 will look at Roman prose. In lecture 21, we'll talk about Roman historiography, and lecture 22 we'll look at the development of the ancient novel. Yes, there were ancient novels as well as modern novels. We'll talk about a couple of them in lecture 22. And finally, as I already mentioned, the last 2 lectures of part 2 will bring together threads from the Hebrew Bible, Greek literature, and Roman culture as they're intertwined in the development of Christianity. Lecture 23 will examine the Gospels, and lecture 24 we'll discuss the great Christian thinker and church father, St. Augustine, whose work had such profound influence on the development of later Christian thought and of Western literature in general. So that's a very quick run-through of what I'll be talking about in which lectures. The next point to touch on is how we're going to approach literature in this course. There are obviously a great many different ways to approach the study and discussion of literature, and each lecturer in the different parts of the course will have a slightly different perspective. The literary critic Carolyn Heilbrunn, who most people probably know better under her pseudonym Amanda Cross, under that name she wrote mystery novels featuring an English professor and detective, Kate Fansler. Carolyn Heilbrunn suggests that there are two basic kinds of literature. And actually, I'm taking this quote from one of her mystery novels. So this is actually the character Kate Fansler saying this, but I think Carolyn Heilbrunn would have accepted it herself. Two basic kinds of literature, quote, that which still speaks to us and our particular anguishes of today, and that which spoke to its contemporary audience and can only have a scholarly interest for us as we try to discover what the work meant to those for whom it was written. Heilbrunn calls the first of these types of study of literature, literature that still speaks to us. She calls that kind of studying literature literary criticism. She calls the second type, where we look at literature to try to see what it tells us about the culture that wrote it, she calls that literary history. She admits that this is a problematic distinction and there's a lot of overlap, but I find it useful as a means of thinking our way into the study of literature. These two different ways of looking at a text. We can look at, say, the Iliad for what it says to us today, how it moves us today, what we can find in it for our own lives. That would be literary criticism in Heilbrunn's definition of the term. Or we can look at the Iliad for what it tells us about the culture in which it was created, the different values, the different worldview that those characters and the implicit first audience had. That would be literary history. And for the purposes of this course, I want to look at the works that we study from both these angles. Almost everything we're reading in this course was chosen because it does, at least to some extent, still speak to us in our anguishes of today. And in fact, when we're dealing with the ancient world, probably most of the works that have survived are still read and are still considered classics because people do still find something directly to connect with in those works. So that would be the literary criticism in Heilbrunn's definition of the term side of my approach. But my own approach as a literary critic, both in my teaching, in my scholarly work, and in what I want to do in this course for you, my own approach incorporates a good deal of what Heilbrunn would call literary history. In other words, I tend in the classroom, in my writing, and here, I tend to try to set the works that I'm talking about in their original context, their own cultural and historical context, however much that's possible and when that's possible. Because I think to have a well-rounded view of literature, we really need both of these approaches. If a work doesn't speak to us in any way whatsoever, we're probably not going to bother to read it. We, meaning people who are not professional scholars, are probably not going to bother to read a work with which they can feel no direct personal connection. But on the other hand, if we don't understand the assumptions and concerns of a culture that created a particular literary work, we will, I think, miss a great deal of its richness. And so I try to use both of those angles in my own approach to literature, and that's the approach I'll be taking in this course. The modern study of literature has produced a great many theoretical approaches, and literary theory is a fascinating topic in its own right. In fact, there is a teaching company course on literary theory for those of you who are interested. I'm not going to adopt any particular theoretical stance as an overarching framework for this course. I'm not going to talk to you as a feminist literary critic or as a Marxist literary critic or as a structuralist or a post-structuralist or a postmodernist or a Foucauldian or any of the numerous possible approaches that one could take. Instead, as I said, I will be trying to discuss the works both for what they can say to us as still living works of literature and as historical, or if you will, cultural artifacts, telling you what they seem to tell us about the culture in which they were formed and how those two things work together to help us understand the texts as richly as possible. In particular, the study of ancient literature brings specific problems with it. I've touched on this already in this lecture, but I want to go into some more detail now about some of those problems. When the literature in question was formed in an oral rather than in a written context, this brings with it a special series of problems and of difficulties in discussing the literature. Paradoxically enough, because after all, I am giving you the introductory lecture of a course called Great Authors of the Western Literary Tradition. Paradoxically enough, for some of the most important early works of Western literature, it's problematic, if not invalid, to speak of an author at all. And we can see this problem with the Epic of Gilgamesh, with the Homeric epics, and even with the Hebrew Scriptures. The Epic of Gilgamesh, which I'll talk about in the next lecture, in lecture number 2, developed over a period of some 1,000 years or more. It exists in several different fragmentary versions on cuneiform tablets. And when I say fragmentary there, I mean literally fragmentary, broken clay tablets. It exists in several different versions on fragmentary cuneiform clay tablets from a period stretching over 1,000 years and in different languages. Can we talk then about a text, about the Epic of Gilgamesh at all, let alone can we talk about an author? When we have various different versions from different time periods and different languages, what does it mean to talk about the author of the Gilgamesh epic, or even about the epic itself? Can we safely assume that the latest version, the one that's usually referred to as the standard version, as I'll talk about in the next lecture, dates from the 7th century BC, that's the latest version we have, is it in some sense the most authentic? Now it's tempting to say, well yes, of course, it's the latest one, therefore it's the best one. But if we think that through, then are Charles and Mary Lamb's tales from Shakespeare, written in the 19th century, more authentic than the First Folio? Or is Laurence Olivier's greatly cut film version of Hamlet a more true, a better, a more authentic version than the quarto or the folio versions? The fact that a version is latest does not necessarily make it best. Another way to go at trying to deal with Gilgamesh, and this is a tactic that's often taken by many modern translators, is to do a compilation, to put together a composite version that preserves the fullest treatment of each individual episode wherever it appears. So one episode from a text written in, say, the 9th century BC, another episode from the 7th century, fill in the gaps wherever you find them. Okay, that gives us a nice complete version, but it represents a work that, as far as we know, never existed in Mesopotamian society. So you see the kind of difficulty that we have as the further back we go, the more crucial this difficulty becomes. What about the Iliad and the Odyssey? They are usually referred to, and rightly so, as the foundational works of Greek literature. It's probably not an exaggeration to say that just about everything else ever written in classical Greece, drama, history, philosophy, lyric poetry, in some sense draws upon the Iliad and the Odyssey. The ancient Greeks themselves attributed these texts to a single author called Homer, and modern scholars still tend to speak of Homer as a kind of convenient shorthand for whatever process by which these epics came to be in the form in which we now have them. That gets awfully cumbersome to say, so we just say Homer. But modern scholarship is virtually unanimous in agreeing that the Iliad and the Odyssey do not represent the work of one individual genius named Homer or anything else, but rather are the culmination of a long oral tradition. Now, we're in better shape with them than we are with the Epic of Gilgamesh. We do have a text. There's an agreed upon version, however it came into being. There's an agreed upon version that classical Greek authors and classical Roman authors knew and referred to, but still referring to an author of these texts, saying that Homer wrote the Iliad and the Odyssey, is, as I said, workable only as a kind of shorthand. The process of composition was actually much more complicated than that. We'll talk about that a bit in Lecture 7. These problems are perhaps most severe of all in our approach to the Hebrew Bible because, of course, this is a sacred text for the religious traditions of three great religions, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, and many of the adherents of those religions consider the Hebrew Bible, and for that matter the New Testament for Christians, but the Hebrew Bible, many of the adherents of those religions consider the Hebrew Bible the Word of God. In other words, if you ask a great many adherents of the three great religions, who's the author of the Bible, the answer would be God. And that may be true in a theological sense. I'm not going to debate that here, but when we're talking about the human authorship of the Bible, the person whose hand actually wrote down the texts that we now have, again, scholarship identifies multiple authors for the different books of the Bible. There is not one author who sat down and wrote out the entire Hebrew Bible. In fact, multiple authors writing at different times are discernible even within individual books, such as Genesis. In Lecture 3, we'll talk about Genesis, how it came into being, the genesis of Genesis, sorry, I couldn't resist that, and the so-called documentary hypothesis, which traces at least 4 different authorial strands in the book of Genesis itself. So again, the earliest works we're talking about, the Epic of Gilgamesh, the Hebrew Bible, the Iliad, and the Odyssey, in this course on great authors of the Western literary tradition, those are works in which our sense of authorship doesn't really apply, and yet they are crucially important foundational works for the Western literary tradition, and that's why we're including them here, obviously. Those are some of the issues and difficulties that we'll consider as we move on into our discussion of the foundational texts of the Western literary tradition. Betty Davis once said in the movie All About Eve, "Fasten your seatbelts, it's going to be a bumpy ride." I'd like to modify that a bit. I hope it's not going to be a bumpy ride, but it is going to be a fast ride, so I would advise you to fasten your seatbelts. As I was working on putting this course together, I found it absolutely exhilarating at the same time as exhausting to work through writing the lectures for 24 lectures on everything about ancient literature. I hope that you will find it equally exciting and rewarding to come along for the ride. So as I said, fasten your seatbelts. And in the next lecture, we'll begin our actual study of the Western literary tradition by looking at the Mesopotamian Epic of Gilgamesh.